sound. Welcome. Thanks for coming out to the far side of the world here. Get your exercise if you've been in the B Hall, that's for certain. Just to set expectations on the talk here, this is obviously about WCF RIA services. If you are someone who has been using RIA services for a while, has played around with the bits, has been building some services and consuming it from clients, and have worked with the validation mechanisms and the security mechanisms and so on, you're probably should go somewhere else, actually, because this session is fairly intro level on the technology. The target audience here is for people who are just taking an initial look at RIA services, trying to figure out, does this technology fit for what you need to do in your applications? And so the focus is going to be to show you all the features, the core features of RIA services and what it can do. Also to talk quite a bit about, scenarios and what are the advantages of using it, where does it fit well, as well as some places that it doesn't fit well. The title of the talk is Ready for Business. The thrust is to try to convince you of that. But this is not a silver bullet. I'm an architect who doesn't believe in silver bullets. There is no one-size-fits-all technology for your service needs. And so we'll talk a little bit about, where does this fit and where might you want to do other things as well. All right, so let's just dive into it. A little background on myself. For My Design, we're a .NET architecture and design consulting and training company. I'm also a Microsoft Regional Director for the Mid-Atlantic region. It's basically Washington, D.C. and the surrounding states. If you're not familiar with that program, we've got a booth down on the show floor in the community area. Excuse me, got a little cough here. Off to the left there, you can go check out and find out some more information. Also, our site there, theregion.com, is an aggregated feed of all the blog posts by the RDs, but it's a moderated feed, so you don't get the hi mom, pictures of the kids type of posts on there. You just get ones that meet a certain technical content bar. So it's a pretty decent feed to read for staying up to date on the latest technologies. And I'm also a Microsoft MVP in the Silverlight category. Do a lot of writing and speaking. The important stuff here is my contact info. We've got a fairly small crowd here, so I would encourage you throughout the session, go ahead and ask questions. I'm happy to field those as we get them, and I'll try to repeat them back to through the microphone so everyone can hear them. If we start to get too far off track with that, though, I may have to hold them till the end so that we stay on timeline. Contact info here, feel free to contact me offline as well if you have follow-on questions or more detailed things you want to discuss. I have already posted, if you go out to my blog there at briannoyes.net, the demos that I'll be doing. I will be doing a fair amount of demos today. Those are already posted out to my blog there. I just posted about an hour ago. So you can go pull down those demos and play around with those yourself as well. All right, so what we're going to go through is first just some high-level overview, make sure everyone understands what RIA Services is and what it can do for you. Then I'll get into starting right off with a demo and talking through how you can use it to query and update data from a Silverlight client primarily. Then we'll get into some information on how you can start validating your data as you do those updates. We'll talk about the security side of things, how you can secure not only your service side, but also get some security context into the client side, which is kind of nice because Silverlight's kind of lacking any kind of client-side security context being available to you. And RIA Services gives you a nice piece of functionality to do that, even if you don't use RIA Services for any of your other service needs. The integration piece I'll talk briefly about is to talk about, what if there are other clients you want to consume your RIA services besides Silverlight? What is the space there and what you can do with them? And then what we're going to finish off with, just to kind of emphasize the Ready for Business theme here, is I've got a customer of mine, Cactus Software. Matt and Jeremy are going to get up here and give you some background on what they've been doing with RIA services in a real-world app, just to kind of prove that this, is not just demoware. It's not just something that looks good on stage. It does actually work for complicated real-world scenarios. So, at a high level, what is RIA Services all about? It's all about making it easy to write your client application and to work with data primarily. Okay, a lot of people come into Silverlight from a Windows Forms kind of background or a ASP.NET classic web development kind of background, and you're probably used to writing two-tier kinds of applications as your primary architecture, that you put all your logic in the layer where the presentation stuff sits. Hopefully you break it out into multiple layers within that presentation tier, as I'm showing here. If not, shame on you and we should talk. But you should be breaking things up that way, but it's still kind of a single tier kind of model as far as where you write your code, and you're probably going out and doing queries against the database, putting your business logic there and working on that data, and it's all kind of nicely, all comfortable in this one little zone. But what happens as soon as you move into a more rich client, RIA, and Silverlight in particular type of environment, is that presentation logic itself has to go somewhere else. It has to go across a service jump generally. And so what RIA Services does is it kind of slides some infrastructure in here in between your presentation and your business layer logically, whether you have those as distinct layers or not. It slides in some infrastructure, a pipeline, if you will, for data and communications with the back end. And it makes it so that you can do that communication without having to get deep into the complexities of WCF. Now, this is not to say that WCF has no meaning itself. Obviously, it's in the title of the technology itself. It is using WCF for this infrastructure, and WCF still has uses for more complicated scenarios where you want full flexibility and control at the service boundary. The way I think about what RIA Services does is it sets up a pre-constructed data pipeline using WCF with kind of prefabricated configuration, hosting, service endpoints, and all that kind of stuff if you've been exposed to the basic building blocks of WCF. It does all that so you don't have to, and it makes it so you don't have to focus on the plumbing, you just focus on your functionality. Now, it's also a very RAD-focused kind of technology, and certainly certain teams at Microsoft have been guilty of pushing out RAD functionality in the past that led you down a path of sort of not-so-great architecture. What I like about this, because our focus at iDesign is all about good architecture and maintainability and so on, the thing I like about this is it takes you down a path of good architecture as well. So it's both productive and gets you in a good place as far as architecture is concerned. So it is very focused, as I said, on data. It's mostly about pushing and pulling entities from the client to the server and back. But you can also expose just generic operations that you want to invoke from the client side to kick off some server-side functionality with it as well. So basically, it's one of the descriptors for it is a prescriptive architecture, and it basically leads you down this path of here's how you set things up, here's some tooling and frameworks that help you out in doing that, and what you end up with is kind of clean vertical slices of functionality within your application. The primary clients this applies to is Silverlight mostly these days. There is some functionality in the current bits for having more of a single tier kind of model or two tier kind of model with ASP.NET web-side presentation logic. In the future, a future release that they've announced, no exact dates or exactly when that's going to show up yet, but they're going to be producing some very similar stuff to what I'm going to be showing in the demos in terms of what you get on the client side. A lot of the benefit here is actually on the client side. You get some code generation that happens on the client side that gives you kind of a rich client-side framework to work with. Some of that same stuff they're working on now. It's a separate project that's currently called WCF jQuery. If you go out to wcf.codeplex.com, you can see some early bits on that. And that's going to give you a lot of these same pieces of functionality for client-side JavaScript in an ASP.NET application, consuming the same services you would define for your Silverlight clients as well, following the same kinds of patterns. But with currently released bits, at least in my mind, the main benefit here is for Silverlight clients. If you're writing something like only a WPF client or only a Windows Forms client, can you consume RIA services? Yes, absolutely. Would that be my choice of a technology if there was no chance of me building a Silverlight client right now? In my mind, no. Because a lot of the benefit does come in on the client side, and you can do these same kinds of things with other WCF-related technologies, such as WCF on its own, which is a lot more work because there's a lot more capability and flexibility there, or you might use WCF data services as another related technology that just exposes data but doesn't give you a lot to work with on the client side. So the overall benefits, built on WCF, so it still leverages the full power and architecture of WCF. It also still gives you, because of that, there are certain extensibility points and configuration things that you can do to customize the endpoints that are generated dynamically for you. But it definitely simplifies WCF. When you do a typical RIA services app, you don't even really have to know that WCF's there. You just define what you want to expose from the server. You get some stuff generated on the client side that makes it really easy to consume, and all the WCF pipeline is auto-generated for you is the easiest way to think about it. Client query and updates, it is all about data, or not all, but most about data in the end. And so a big part of that is being able to pull data down. The querying functionality is very rich. It makes it easy to go get the data. You're able to do it in a link-based way, so you get a deferred execution. I'll show in the demos. You get kind of a deferred execution across multiple tiers the way the querying happens if your backend provider is a link provider. And on the update side, it makes updates very seamless and easy. It'll track all the changes on the client side, which comes into the next bullet here. You get change tracking of original values and change values. It's monitoring all that and caching it on the client side. You can decide when you want to submit a batch of changes from the client side back. It'll take care of chopping those all up, calling individual methods, and getting the updates done for you with optimistic concurrency and other patterns if you want. Shared validation, once you're doing your updates, you need to make sure that data is valid before you even submit from the client, or it'll, last ditch on the server side. So what you get to do is just define your validation rules once, and they automatically get applied on both the client and server side. If they're applied on the client side, you're never even going to get to the server, which is generally what you want. But you can't guarantee that the only clients of your service are your RIA service clients, so that it's also validated on the server side if someone else comes in. And we'll look at several forms of that in the demos. Security, like I mentioned, is a nice feature because it makes it just a really boilerplate, easy to get your security hooked up, and you can authenticate and authorize from the client side in your Silverlight app, or you can do it on the server side. You can do it in a surrounding web app. You've got a lot of options there, but it's a very quick, easy, declarative way of going about it. And then flexible data sources. If you work with Entity Framework or Link to SQL, you have the best benefit in terms of productivity and radness, if you will. But it is very flexible that you can use any data source. You could go out to an LDAP store if you want and get your data from there. But it definitely starts to really shine when you use a link-enabled provider under the covers, because then you get that deferred execution across tiers I was talking about. So basically, these all come together in a nice coherent whole to make RIA services worth using. What do you need? If you're already got the Silverlight tools on your machine to be able to build Silverlight apps, you already have RIA services. And you may have noticed as you create Silverlight apps, which I'll do shortly here, a little checkbox that says Enable WCF RIA services. That's the thing that hooks up the code generation mechanism that I mentioned before. There is a couple of other pieces you need to be aware of. One is the RIA Services Toolkit. This is a separate library, if you will, or set of libraries that you can download and install, and it installs some of the enhanced capabilities to target other clients with other endpoint types I'll touch on at the end. It also gives you that ASP.NET capability that I talked about that's available today. And that will be a shipping vehicle for an early look at new things that they're working on as well, like most of the other toolkits with the Silverlight toolkits and WPF toolkits and so on. The RIA Services SP1 is already released. If you've got Visual Studio 2010 Service Pack 1, you've got RIA Services Service Pack 1 installed. And that basically, I won't go through all the bullets there, but it basically brings in just some nice features to enhance larger scale scenarios with RIA services. SP2 is already in work. There's a number of good features coming along there. One is a little bit better MVVM support. For those in the crowd, Model View model, if you don't recognize the acronym. One of the demos I'll do today, I'm using MVVM. It works just fine with MVVM today, depending on which patterns you implement. This just gives a little bit more enhanced support if you want to bind directly to some of the collections that they're managing under the covers. You can do that. It has better change notifications and things being raised to support MVVM scenarios in SP2. Entity Framework Code First is a feature that came out with Entity Framework 4.1, which was released at Mix conference about a month ago. My customer, Cactus, that's going to be up here, is going to talk about they're using that feature already in their thing. So it is sort of available with some workarounds already with Service Pack 1. Service Pack 2 is just going to kind of clean that up and get rid of some of those workarounds for you. Daytime offset is just a small thing about working with time zones. And probably the biggest thing is to align with the Silverlight 5 release that's due out towards the end of the year. So that's big picture, what's RIA services about. And as I mentioned, the thing to keep in mind is for Silverlight clients, it is sort of a perfect fit for any kind of CRUD-oriented data type stuff, as well as additional calls related to that data that you might want to make to the back end. But if you're doing some big complicated SOA enterprise, enterprise service bus integrating with multiple protocols and distributed transactions and all kinds of stuff like that, probably want to use full-blown WCF for that, because this does set up somewhat of a silo of communication between the client and the service. It is exposed as services, just normal either SOAP, JSON, REST-based services that you can configure, so it is consumable by other clients, but its biggest benefit comes from the client side in my mind. So what I'm going to jump into now is let you see, what does querying and updating look like using this technology. And I'm just going to build out an app end-to-end really quickly here in the demo. We're going to start with an app that has the standard structure of a Silverlight app, a client-side project that's a Silverlight project, a server-side web host project where the server-side bits are going to live and be exposed to the Silverlight client. When you start going about this, the approach is, first you focus on what goes on the back end, and that's kind of the mentality going into RIA services, is you define what is the back end functionality you want to expose to the client. And then what happens is you do that in the form of what's called a domain service. A WCF RIA services domain service is the base class that you'll derive from. That domain service, so the data access and entities is kind of up to you. In this demo, I'm going to be using Entity Framework with a database first, just because it's quick and easy for a demo. But you can use any of the models of Entity Framework with code first, POCO, model first. You can use any other data access technology you choose to if you're going with the POCO or plain old CLR object entity model. After that, you define your domain service, and that's the thing that's going to expose functionality to your client. And then basically you compile. And when you compile, it's going to code generate on the client side corresponding entities, because you have different references for the Silverlight app than the backend app, so you can't just share a reference to those entities. But it generates new entities on the client side that mirror the data and functionality of those entities on the server side. Those entities that get generated on the client side include some base class functionality for things like property change notifications and validation support. And then from there, you build out your presentation layer with views and view models if you're using MVVM that sit on top and consume that data and present it to the user. So with that, let me just jump into a demo here and show you what it looks like. All right, so I'm going to just start from scratch here with a Silverlight application project. There is a separate template here called the Silverlight Business App that you can see is specific to RIA services. This is, think of this like the empty ASP.NET web app versus the ASP.NET web app template. This one, the business application one, is populated with a login dialog. Security is all hooked up. It's got a couple of sample screens to navigate between and so on. So if you want more of a clean slate approach, you can just start with a Silverlight app. We'll call this RIA demo. There's already one of those. We'll call it RIA demo 2. Okay, and this is the standard dialog when you start up a Silverlight app. It's going to ask you, do you want a host project? When you're using RIA services, you absolutely do need a host project because there's got to be somewhere for those services to live. And this checkbox at the bottom is the one I mentioned that if you check that box, that's going to set up the linkage between the client-side project and the server-side project to do the code generation that I was mentioning about. If you forget to check it here, don't worry, it's just a project setting that you can set or change later on. So that will set up our 2 projects here in Solution Explorer as soon as it pops up. And the first thing we're going to do is go define some data to work with. The data that I'm going to work with today, I've got a little database of task and time entry type information. So I'm just going to go in and do a quick add, new item, go to data, ADO.NET Entity Data Model, and we'll just call this tasks model. We'll look at the schema here after I generate it. So we'll generate from the database, from this task manager database, and we'll just check the box for all tables to make it quick here. All right. So just wait for it to settle down here. What it just did there is, if you're not familiar with any framework, it just added some references. It generated this EDMX file, which is a combination really of 3 files. It's the mappings that set up a mapping from your entity model that it just generated based on the database down to the tables they correspond to in the database. The main entities we're going to work with today here are a task. And in a later demo, this one I'm just going to use task on, but a later demo just to show you the model we're working with. Each task can have a collection of time entries for kind of bookkeeping, and then it's got a related customer. The other entities in here, project and user, we won't be using in the demos. So task, customers, and time entries are the main object model we're dealing with here. Once I have that, if you're playing around with this stuff, an important step right now is build, because what I'm going to do next, actually, Visual Studio is going to reflect on my assembly. So now we step into the RIA service stuff, and basically it's a template that you can invoke from the web category. So I'll say add new item again, web, and I'm looking for the domain service class. And as I said, this is where you focus on the server side of what you want to expose to the client side. So I'll call this my task domain service. And you can see it basically reflected on my assembly, found any entity framework models that are part of that assembly or referenced assemblies, and we'll show them here in a selection. You can go to an empty domain service class if you're doing the plain old CLR object model, and at that point, you might as well just create the class yourself, because it's really just declaring a class with a base class for you. But if you work against a framework, it's going to do a one-time code generation. This dialog is kind of a one-stop shopping. You can't get back to this after you've done the code gen, so think about your selections the first time, or you have to go code gen and do some copy-paste, move code around. But ultimately, all it's doing is it's setting up the basic query patterns and update patterns of working with your entity model. So for this one, I'm going to check the box and say I'll just work with tasks in this demo, and I do want to be able to do updates to those tasks as well, so I'll check the enable editing. And the difference here is it's just going to generate insert, update, and delete methods related to tasks. This expose OData endpoint I'll touch on a little bit at the end, but when I refer back to the checkbox in the original dialog, this is what I mean up here, is that you can check this and get an OData feed exposed from your service as well. And this metadata down here, you'll generally just leave that checked. I'll show you what that generates in a later demo. So we go through that. It added a few more references. Any of these domain service references you see over here are related to RIA services. So it adds those into our project. And it code generated our task domain service that we have open right here. It generated this metadata file, and it added a few web.config entries to set up that kind of pre-built WCF hosting stuff that I talked about. You can see some service model stuff down here, some modules, and just a few entries it puts into the web config. So let's focus on the task domain service first. You can see that this one, because I'm working directly with Entity Framework, I'm using the base class linked to entities domain service. This one is aware of the query patterns and update patterns of Entity Framework. Now, even if you're using Entity Framework, you don't always have to use this one. This one is kind of the quick rad way to go. It's not always as optimal about the queries, especially update scenarios. If you have a table with 50 columns and you send down updates to only 2 columns, it's going to blast all 50 with the new values. So sometimes people will step away from this one and still use the domain service-based class and write their own queries just to be able to optimize a little more. But this one just makes it very streamlined, especially for smaller scale scenarios, to just use it directly. You can see that it generated a single query method here. And if you recognize the interface there, iQueryable of T is the basis of expression trees in LINQ. It's the way that you can represent. It does not return a collection. The way to think about it is it returns the expression that tells you how you can get a collection. And so when this method is called, this is not the exposed service method that the client will call. The client is actually going to call a load method and pass its own expression tree down, or at least it has the opportunity to. So the client can pass down an expression tree. This thing's going to return a server-side expression tree, and then out in the RIA services stack, before it returns some results to the client, it's able to merge those two and formulate the final expression tree it will execute to come up with the collection. So what that means is if you were doing this with raw WCF, for example, you would often have to define a get tasks that returns all tasks, and a get task by task ID that returns a single task, and a get task by date range, and so on, and all these one-off kind of methods to allow different query patterns from the client. With this technology, with the iQueryable, you expose just this one method, because the client can say by date, by order by, whatever kind of queries they want to put on there, .orderbys, .take, .skip, all these kind of link operators, they can just tack onto their expression tree, and that gets sent down to the server side and executed on the server side. If the server side is using, as this is, you can see this object context here is an Entity Framework object context. If you're using a link-capable provider to do the queries, that can just get passed down all the way to the database. So if I'm all the way over on my Silverlight client, 2 tiers away from the database, and then I say .where.orderby, that ends up as a SQL statement that says .where.orderby, or not dots, but you get the idea. So that's a pretty powerful mechanism that you get the deferred execution across multiple tiers. For the update side of things, you can see that you just get an individual method insert, update, delete methods. There are some naming conventions and things to these you can read about in the docs as to how it identifies those. But you can see you get to deal with one entity at a time, because often your business rules are focused on, for a given entity type, here's the rules that apply to it, and here's how I go about updating that one entity. Now, if you want to deal with more of the whole batch that comes down, if you look at this, again, keep in mind these are not the exposed service methods. It would be a bad design to have a chatty communication and say, update this one, this one, this one, this one. What it does is there's a base class method is the real exposed service method called submit. And you can see this thing takes in a change set. So it's actually going to send down a batch of changes from the client side, all the things it was change tracking on the client side, and knowing that we added this and updated this and so on. It's just going to send those down as a batch, chunk it up, and call your insert, update, delete methods individually. So it makes it very easy to deal with these update scenarios. Okay, so with that in place, I can go ahead and just do a build here, and that's where the magic happens on the client side. As soon as I build, it goes out and does some code gen on the client side. And if you look at the project, it's not readily apparent, but if you show all files, you'll see this generated code folder. And down inside of here, there's a number of types defined. The first one to focus on is this task domain context. The domain context, think of it as a proxy, a client-side proxy that lets you get to your corresponding domain service. So you get a one-to-one kind of relationship here. I define this domain service, I get a client-side domain context that lets me get to it. And that's the thing that you're going to execute load operations, submit change operations on to interact with your data. And you can also invoke methods, just arbitrary methods, as I mentioned, that you define on your domain service. You can see we also got a code-generated task entity type that mirrors basically the task type that's part of our entity model back here. If you're familiar with entity framework, we see a pretty picture of a task here. It's really a code-generated type under the entity framework model. So it basically code-generated a corresponding type on the client side that has all the same properties, but also has a different base class that gives us that rich functionality I was mentioning. So this entity base class on the client side depends on the RIA service libraries on the client side to give you change tracking, change notifications, and validation support are the primary things down there. So now the quick look ma no code kind of demo that I can do here that demos real well, but honestly is not super real world, is I can go into the main page. I can go into the data sources window, and it'll just take a moment for it to pop in here. It basically reflects, it finds those code-generated entity types, and it generates data sources for them. And I can just drag and drop this out, and it'll generate some XAML for me. Mostly what it's doing is looking at that type and its properties and just generating a data grid with the appropriate columns on it. That functionality has been around since Windows Forms 2.0 and is new in 2010 for WPF and Silverlight. The rest of the code gen is it generated something called a RIA Services domain data source. And this is a chunk of XAML basically that can go and make a service call for you. And this is why I say, in my mind as an architect, I don't like this thing a whole lot because I don't want to put that kind of logic in my XAML. But if you're going for a quick prototype, a RAD thing, a proof of concept, you just got to get something out the door and you're all about productivity, this thing's awesome because you can just drag and drop and data just flows. So if I run this thing, you can see that I didn't write any code at this point. That domain data source, as the client loads up, you saw the data grid was empty for a moment. It makes an asynchronous call. So if you're not familiar in Silverlight, anytime you make service calls, they got to be asynchronous because you can't block that browser thread, you can't block the UI. So they set up a nice async pattern here. They make the asynchronous call. When it's complete, they've pulled back the entities on a background thread. They marshal it to the UI thread for you. They populate the collection. The collection fires collection changed events, and your bindings just update nice and magically there in Silverlight. And most of that is just standard Silverlight infrastructure, just binding functionality. It's the asynchronous invocation, the update of the collection, and the thread marshaling that RIA Services takes care of for you. Okay, so what if I want to do some updating of data? These entities that I'm bound to here are being tracked, as I said, by the domain context. You can see that this chunk of XAML actually has an instance of a task domain context in it, and that's the thing really making the calls. So once it's retrieved some entities, it's got pointers to all those entities, it's subscribed to property change notifications on those, and it's tracking what's changing about those. So if I just modify anything in the screen because I'm bound to those same entities, it's going to know about it, and then I can just tell it submit changes, and those will be pushed back down to the server side. So I'll just grab my grid here, make some room, do a little crude UI update here. I won't bother labeling the button, but picture that as a save button. I'll double click on it to get an event handler. And now I've got to get to that same domain context because there is an instancing model here. But I can just go out and say I need to get to my task domain context and resolve that to its child namespace. And I can go grab it from my tasks domain data source dot domain context and just cast it to its known type. Once I have that thing, I can just say context dot submit changes. And whatever it has tracked that have been updated at that point, it'll send. This again is a non-blocking asynchronous call that goes out. There are, I'll show you in a later demo, there's completed events and things you can handle for error handling and seeing what changes come back. The other piece of magic that's going on here is if I make some changes to an entity on the client side and I send it to the server side, what often happens at that point? The server-side entity gets updated by having, especially if it's an add or something, primary keys are generated. You might have computed fields on the server side. So, excuse me. Even though the signature doesn't make it apparent, what also happens behind the scenes is it sends the changes, iterates through those changes as I talked about already, but then it sends the modified or the updated entities back to the client side, auto-merges those with the ones that are being cached so that your client side, again, reflects the true state of the server side. So that's where all that change tracking stuff is just a little box on my slide, but it's a whole lot of work to write that kind of stuff yourself, and they've got a nice, robust infrastructure for doing that. So at this point, I can go ahead and run this again, and just go ahead and modify one of these entities. I'll just kind of corrupt the description here, press the button, and just to prove that it did it, I can refresh the whole app, and you can see that that change is reloaded from the server side, so it was persisted. All right, so with that, let me jump back to the slides for a moment. Just kind of recap what you saw. So you saw the entities you work with can pretty much be any entity type, any plain old TLR object with properties, but if you use entity framework, then you get to leverage some of the data access benefits I talked about with deferred execution. RIA Services also does support link to SQL. If you've already made an investment there and you've got some link to SQL types and data access and stuff, you can just wrap that with RIA Services and it works just as well. For new work starting, I generally recommend people stick with entity framework these days. And POCO, again, plain old CLR object means anything else you want to go and retrieve. You just have to do a little bit more work on the back end yourself. The query operations, I showed a single iQueryable, which can return collections or individuals. You can define individual methods that just return a single entity type. You can also define your query methods to just return IEnumerables if your underlying source is not a link-capable provider anyway. You can load it, you saw through the domain data source declaratively in the XAML, and I'll show in the next demo you can also just programmatically interact with that domain context to tell it to load when you want to load and specify expression trees that you want it to use. Update operations, as I said, everything's tracked by the domain context on the client side, so you just call that submit changes, pushes those down, does all that magic merging I just talked about. All right, so the next thing I wanted to get into here is, once you get into updating your entities, validation obviously becomes fairly important to you. And so there's a very nice model here. You basically have several choices. The easiest and sort of recommended starting point is to leverage a facility that's in the .NET framework called system.componentmodel.data annotations, or data annotation attributes in general. These are in .NET 4. They're used by Silverlight and RIA Services. They're used by ASP.NET Dynamic Data. They're used by ASP.NET MVC. They are becoming a fairly standard infrastructure for declaratively expressing your intent of validation. And it's basically some attributes that you can tack on to the properties of your entity types to say, for this property, it's required. The built-in ones are required, string length, regular expressions, ranges, and then there's a custom validation one that you can point to your own arbitrary logic with that I'll show. So that's one way I'll demonstrate here in a moment. Another option you have is sometimes you actually have to go ahead and let the client do what it does and then send the data to the server, and then the server has to do some computation, some lookups, some decisions that you don't want to reside on the client side. And so you still need the ability, once you've done a submit, to reject that submit for validation reasons and to still have good, clean validation indications back on the client side once that round trip completes. So there's a very clean mechanism for that by just throwing a validation exception I'll show. And then the third one I'll show quickly is that sometimes the logic's got to be on the server side, but you still want to get information to the client as soon as possible. And so you can do asynchronous invocations from the client side, and this will also show you that model I said that you can just expose arbitrary methods and call those asynchronously from your Silverlight client. This will show you what that looks like, but the context of this one is using them for validation. All right, so back into demo mode here. So this one, I'm going to switch over to a more fully completed sample here. I'll just run it real quick so you can see what it looks like. We're working with the same basic entities, tasks, time entries, and customers. And yes, I do want to debug. Oh, no. If you get that dialog, don't do what I just did. Actually read it and heed what it's telling you. What it was telling me is that this is going to happen. And I just blindly said stupidly, no, sure, go ahead. Don't mind me. What I was saying is when you're running a RIA services project, you always got to make sure your server-side project is the startup project. With Silverlight, you can always debug against the Silverlight project as the startup one, but then it doesn't know where the services live to go and call them. So I just had to switch it there to get back onto the server-side project. And so I'll go hit my page here now. I'm going to get to security next, but you can see this is actually secured in a very unsecure way with revealed passwords and hard-coded identities, but it is using the security model for that. So we've got, clearly not a UI design session, a very beautiful, elegant UI here, but basically we've got some task information at the top, similar to the last demo. We've got some other query capabilities in this demo I won't be using. We've got to save changes up here to submit changes back. Down at the bottom here, I can go and affiliate a customer if I select a task. I can associate a customer with that task, and then I can go and start adding time entries for it. I can also define a new customer. So if I go in here now, a little bit of a contrived scenario in the data model here just to show the validation scenarios. If I say that this customer has a phone, then I probably should provide one. So I would want to indicate some validation problems with that. And so you can see if I check that. Now the presentation that you're seeing here is just pure Silverlight. Individual controls in Silverlight have built into their templates the red border that you see in the little triangle and the tooltips. So basically, RIA Services doesn't have to do anything there. It just has to put the right validation information in place, and the bindings can read it out via it's an interface called iNotifyDataErrorInfo is the one it's based on. And if I get this thing in a consistent state, you can also see as soon as I start putting in entries, now the other validation is not in place, but there's a different validation rule associated with phone based on a regular expression that ensures it's in a consistent, kind of US phone format kind of way. And as soon as I hit that, the errors go away. So that's one of the validation mechanisms. Those are both driven by data annotation attributes that we'll look at. The other one I'll look at here is when I go to add a time entry, you can see that I'm setting description as a required field, and that shows up immediately. As soon as I satisfy that, we're good to go. But I may have other forms of validation such that I got to go look up on the server side. So for example, I have a rule that certain customers, based on their history or their credit history or whatever, we don't want to log too many hours for that customer in a given billing cycle. So if I try to log more than 10 hours for a given customer is the rule that's going to get invoked here, I want to block that input on the client side, but that logic all resides on the server side. So this is a case where I'm making an asynchronous call through an invoke method to go look up that information. As soon as I get it back, then I can react to it on the client side. Now in this case, you'll see the code is a little twisted because I need to block for an asynchronous call, and that's not something that's clean and easy to do. So I have to do some weird stuff with the dialogues to truly block the user in this case. But you could put up a busy indicator or something like that as another way of going about it. And then the one other thing I'll have to turn off some code to show it is that I can also turn off that client-side asynchronous invoke and go ahead and submit the update with invalid data, and then we'll see the validation indications for that. So just not going to go through in detail, just want to give you a quick glimpse of what this looks like. Because I'm working with an entity framework model here, I can't go just tweak my entity types and put attributes on their properties because that's code-generated code from the entity framework model. And that's where this metadata class comes in, or metadata classes that it code-generated for me. What you do is you set up a partial type on your entity type so that you can sort of extend it. You still can't extend the properties directly, but what you do is you associate a metadata type, or a buddy type it's called, that you point to, and that buddy type declares the same properties that the real type has. And you don't have to redeclare all of them. You only have to declare the ones that you're going to add something to in the form of attributes. And the way to think about it is it takes these attributes and just kind of merges them onto the entity when it does the code generation on the client side. And on the server side, when it's enforcing things, it's checking both definitions, the full definition plus the metadata type for attributes associated with properties. So for the validation ones we did, here's the the required field on the time entry when I added the description there. And here is on the customer, you can see for the phone property, I've got both the regular expression and enforcing format. I've also got that cross-field validation being done using the same validation rule. I'll show the code briefly here, but you just point to it through this custom validation attribute. You point to a type and a method name on that type that will be invoked for validation. Now that type, if I'm going to enforce it on both the client side and server side, has to reside on both sides, and I don't want to maintain two chunks of code. So what I can do is just put that in a .shared file here, and any .shared file, yes sir?
Yeah, what's the benefit of having to redeclare what we
I wouldn't say there's any benefit to having to redeclare the properties. It's more, it is a workaround for the fact that you're dealing with code-generated entities. If you code-gen your own entities, as my friends from Cactus are doing, then you can put whatever attributes you want right on your own entities. If you use a POCO model, you can just declare them on the properties themselves. It's more a compensation for the fact that you're, in this case, I'm using the database-first model of entity framework. Okay, so the shared files here, anytime you declare a .shared file, it will be also code-generated to the client side, or really just kind of copy-generated to the client side. Now that does require that whatever you do inside that shared file class, you don't reference any namespaces that are not going to be present on the Silverlight side. But you can see here I just declare there's a particular signature you go to. I'm not going to go through all the code, but it's basically comparing the two different fields, has phone and phone in this case, and checking consistency of those. So you can use these custom validators to do cross-field validations very easily because it has access to the whole object. And when you do the client-side code gen then, those things all show up on the client side. Client side only has one entity definition. They don't have this split world because of the entity framework stuff. So if we go down into the generated code folder here, to the web.g.cs, and look at this task, or actually let's look at we'll just go to the time entry to show one of them. And we go to the description property on that one, you will see that it's got a required attribute. You will also, if you go look at these, sometimes you'll see string lengths showing up here on the client side that you never declared yourself. And that's because Entity Framework itself will use the string length attributes in its code-generated stuff based on the field size in the database. So that gets reflected out to the client side, and you get immediate validation that you can't put in too many characters in the limited character input kind of field. Yes?
So that you can extend the metadata class to add your shared attributes to it? How did you, when you regenerate your main class, you lose all that attributes?
Actually, you don't. So the question was, do you have to do something here so that the metadata class doesn't get blown away when you do your code generation? That's actually the whole point of the metadata class. Is this is not this is not the task class generated by Entity Framework. The one generated by Entity Framework is marked as a partial class. So you can add separate, additional stuff to that class in a separate file that you own, and Entity Framework CodeGen never touches. So this is code that you own. You modify it. No one else auto modifies this. And the way it gets tied into that code generated one again is through this linkage through the metadata class. So there's actually nothing. If you look structurally here, there's nothing in my partial class of task. The convention here is you define a nested, sealed class as the metadata class, but that's not even required. You just got to be able to point to that type. But the real modifications are happening on this class that technically has nothing to do with tasks. It's just a class with some properties on it. But through the structure, it's able to infer and say, okay, through this attribute up here, I know that you're pointing to that as your buddy type. So I'll go pull all the attributes off those properties and put them onto the associated properties of the real entity.
What if your task to make that so that you originally went in and picked which table you wanted? Say you added a new table to your database, and new table created a framework.
Yeah, and that's where the one-time code gen comes in. At that point, if you're kind of incrementally doing this stuff, you're probably going to have to just define these yourself by hand. So the question was, if you're incrementally adding new types, will you get the metadata classes generated? And the answer is generally no, unless you're setting up separate domain services as you add those types. All right, so that's what the annotation attributes look like. Let me show you quickly the client-side code that was doing the async call there. First off, what's it calling on the server side? I mentioned these invoke methods. Let's just go find the corresponding method here, which is called isTotalTimeAllowed. And you can see this is just a normal, logic method that I take some parameters into. I can return a value from. There are some constraints on the parameter types that you can do. You can read about that in the docs. And you just put an invoke attribute on it. And when it does its client-side code gen now, the domain context will have a corresponding method that you can invoke on the client side as a asynchronous method. And so this is the logic that's enforcing that if I have a low threshold customer, that we only allow 10 hours of time for them in a given time span. And this is actually being called from the client side. Now this one is actually set up as a view model type of thing, MVVM style. When you do that, all it really means is you will create your domain context as a member, is a normal way of doing this within your view model, and you'll just make your calls from your view model when you got to talk to the server side. So down inside of here, I've got a point here where I get to some nasty little code where I'm basically saying, okay, I'm adding a time entry, but I got to go validate that rule that I know lives on the server side. And most of this, like I said, is kind of grungy dialog management that I shouldn't be doing in a view model in the first place. If anyone's familiar with the pattern, I'm completely violating the pattern there by popping dialogues. But you can see here I can just I could either use my existing one or new up a new one and just call isTotalTimeAllowed as a service method. Now it will be blocking, so I got to get the Boolean back from that. In this case, I'm hooking up a callback handler, an action up here that I'm pointing to, and that's this chunk of work up here that is going to do some dialog management, or if it succeeded, go ahead and add the time entry in. But you can see you just get nice, easy to call methods, non-blocking asynchronous service methods on your domain context. Now if I turn all that off, and just to show the last variant here, I can just comment all this out and bring one line of code back in. In this case, I'm not even going to validate on the client side, but it's possible the server side may still have some validation there that applies at the point where I submit. So if I fire this thing back up, get back to the page here, and put in my creds. Okay, so I go and select a customer again, and this one happens to have that low threshold on it. Try to add a time entry, satisfy the required thing, and put a big time window on this that's more than 10 hours. Client side's fat, dumb, and happy because it doesn't know about that rule at this point. But at the point where I do save changes, you can see now we're on the back end. We're inside of our task domain service, and we're throwing a validation exception. And you can put an error message here. You can tell what properties it's associated with. There's a number of things you can do on this validation exception. Because it's implicitly associated with a single task, RIA Services is able to kind of bundle that up, send that information back to the client, and then the client-side framework can associate it with that one entity and the bindings and stuff that are tied to it. So if I run past this error now, with no extra code anywhere, basically just based on the mode of the data grid here, it'll only show it if you're in edit mode. But you can see now that that error shows up associated with that one and only one entity on the client side. And all you have to do basically is throw a validation exception in your insert, update, or delete method at the appropriate time. All right, so with that, back to slides for a moment. Let's see how are we doing on time? Okay. The last piece I want to show you here is the security functionality that's available. And I just wanted to emphasize again, what do you have here? Well, you got to take into account that your Silverlight app lives somewhere. It lives within a web application. You get to your Silverlight app initially, in most cases, unless you went to Steve Lasker's session in the last hour about doing offline Silverlight clients. You get to your Silverlight app by browsing to it initially. So it's got a surrounding thing that can have a security context itself, the hosting website. So one option is you can just have them log in through an ASP.NET login page, for example, establish a secure session, and now there's kind of a warm, cuddly blanket around your application that makes it secure that they can't get to it unless they've already authenticated. That's good for kind of blocking access to your app. But what it doesn't give you is you have no notion of that security context inside of the Silverlight app, and you have no access to it. So if you want to do things like role-based assertions that turns off functionality in your Silverlight app, based on who the authenticated user is and what role they're in or what permissions they have, you don't have any pre-built infrastructure in Silverlight to do that. But RIA Services gives you a nice mechanism for that. So you can do authentication and authorization, server-side only, or both client and server-side. You can do the initial login from inside of the Silverlight app, or you can rely on the hosting website to do that for you. On the server side, inside of your domain services, to block access to different data and functionality, you have a nice declarative model I'll show in the demo here with attributes. On the client side, you get a security context established that you can then do role-based assertions, know who the user is, even do personalization based on the user's information, and that all becomes available to you in the Silverlight side. So with that, let's see what that looks like. Switching back here. This is the same exact code I was just running, as you can see here. And the pieces of this are, first off, let's look at the server configuration. It's mostly driven by standard ASP.NET membership and role provider type stuff. So if you've been exposed to that for ASP.NET websites, you're already golden in understanding how the back-end infrastructure is going to work for looking up users and looking up roles and so on. I'm not going to go into details on that, but you can just see here that there is some membership and role provider stuff hooked up in the web here. Now in this case, just to keep it portable for demo purposes, I am using custom membership and role providers, and you can see I had a hard-coded username password kind of thing here that I was doing based on some stuff tucked away in here, but that was that Brian iDesign one I was using. So that's what's actually being consulted in this demo, but you can use the stock membership providers or your own custom membership provider for that lookup, as well as role providers. On the server side, if you want to secure access to the service calls, all you need is a single attribute at a service level that says, I need authentication before I let someone in here. So it puts the big door out in front that they got to come in with some credentials. Those credentials could have been already provided, as I said, by establishing a secure session in the website, or you could collect them in the RIA Services app, and I'll show the client side of that in a moment here, and send them down from the RIA Service app. And then if you want to do some role-based authorization on the server side, that can be declarative as well. You can see I have one method down here that says we can only add customers if we're in a manager role. So we can just do a requires role. Or we can do more imperative kind of programmatic logic. And somewhere up here, there we go. You can see I can just use the user object. There's a little bit of extra infrastructure you have to set up to capture that user object on initialization. You can look at the demo code for that. But it becomes accessible to you as basically an iPrincipal object. If you've dealt with that in .NET, you can do is-enroll checks on the iPrincipal. You can get to the identity of the principal. And so I'm just doing a standard is-enroll check here, and that ends up going out over the role provider to look up and see whether the authenticated user is in that manager role. And in this case, we're basically saying that managers can see all tasks, but other users can only see the tasks that they are associated with as a user. So that's what it looks like on the server side. What about the client side? Well, all you have to do, and this is the part where I mentioned, and I want to reemphasize that even if you look at all the other stuff I've demoed and you go, yeah, that's just crud, I can do that myself. And you want to do other means, WCF data services, WCF, just go to the isolated storage, whatever your app requires. If you do want to have this back-end authenticated, authorized context into the client side, you can just use the feature I'm going to show now in total isolation from the rest of RIA services. And that is that you would go and you would add to your server side a different kind of domain service, one called an authentication domain service. I won't click add here because this one's already got one. You can see here I've got this tasks authentication domain service, and you can see how much code is required to actually leverage it. Okay, this is what it generates when you use that template. The only change I made was I already have a different user type, so I had to change the name of the user type it generated. But basically, the base class is the one that's cognizant of the membership and role providers. If people are curious, what's going on in terms of passing the credentials, it is leveraging cookies. So it's using cookies on the wire with the service calls and from the surrounding website as the means of transferring credentials, standard ASP.NET security stuff there. So you will need to set up a cookie container if you're going offline and out of browser and stuff in the client app. There's some good blog posts by the team on that, or you can just ping me by email or something and I can point you to some resources. But if you're staying inside the browser and the browser stack, it all happens automatically for you anyway. So this base class kind of does it all for you. And this user type also means you have a place that you can define custom properties associated with the user. This does become another entity type that is generated on the client side and is populated and the information is transferred. So you can tie this in with the profile system of ASP.NET and have custom preferences and things like that associated with the user that you transfer through this mechanism. Once you have that thing, you do your build again, your code gen happens, and what you get on the client side, one of those other code generated types, go to the client side here to our generated code, and you'll see that there's this thing called a web context. And this thing has it's got a singleton kind of model, web context.current, so you can get to it anywhere in the app, and you can see it has an instance, a populated instance of that user type hanging off of it. So down inside of my client-side code then, I can first log in the user using the web context. So you can see here in my login dialog, I'm basically going through webcontext.current.authentication.login, pass the username, password. Again, all calls have to be asynchronous, so you have to handle completion on that. This shows that you can just subscribe to a completed event. And then when it comes back, we check and see whether we had an error or whether we had login success and do the appropriate thing. At that point, that client and server side security context and session has been established. And then anywhere else in the app, such as down inside my view model where I want to enforce some rules, I can just do a quick check here on is in role. And you can see that anywhere in my app I want to do a check, I can just do a web context.current user is in role check and turn things on or off based on that. So very slick, easy to use, well-tested and secure infrastructure for doing this. And can use that whether you're going to use RIA services for the rest of your app or not. With that, the last thing I'm going to talk about here just really quickly is what about other clients, okay? I mentioned some of this in the demo, that what really gets exposed is a service boundary. It is still, first and foremost, a WCF service. If you're curious, the actual binding type, if you're familiar with WCF bindings, it's actually a custom binding that is HTTP protocol, but it's binary encoded. And it's actually a REST-based kind of API. So, you might ask yourself, a lot of people think about REST as, I go to REST for interoperability, but if I'm going with a proprietary binary encoding, how interoperable is that? And you might ask yourself, why did they bother doing that? It turns out that, when you do REST, your retrievals are done with GETs, and GETs can be cached by the web infrastructure, and so you get more efficient queries is the bottom line of why REST is the right answer there for a thing that's very much about querying data. But you're not stuck to that pre-built, kind of prefabricated binding that they set up for the Silverlight client. You can check that box I showed at the beginning, and you get a read-only OData feed of the query methods that are exposed from your RIA services. That doesn't allow you to update, and it also doesn't support the full range of OData protocol at the current time. They are looking into ways of enhancing that and evolving that in future releases. You can also turn on, if you use the RIA Services Toolkit, you can turn on a SOAP endpoint or a REST formatted, or a JSON formatted REST endpoint. And those are full functionality, insert, update, delete kind of stuff, as well as querying. So those you can consume from any client. Now, the only downside I would say to this in terms of consuming from any other kind of client is that there's a little bit of wrapper stuff in terms of the API you expose is just kind of a one-stop shop service contract that has load methods with entity set is what it takes, or the expression tree thing that it passes, and then the change sets that come down with a submit operation. So you have to do a little bit of unwrapping, but under those structures, you've got strongly typed entities that you can pull out, deserialize, and work with on just about any client. So those, just to show you here real quick in the code, All it takes is a little bit of config. If I go into the web config of this demo, you can look at this for reference. I do have to have an extra reference up here that's from the toolkit that's Microsoft domain services instead of system.domain services. And then I just have a little extension here to the service model section that declares those different endpoints. And at that point, those light up as well as the default endpoint of the RIA service. So with that, let's go back here. And time to hand it over to my friends from Cactus. So they're going to get up and tell you a little bit about the solution that they've been working on and their impressions of RIA services, just to kind of make it real. Guys, over to you. And we'll switch to your laptop. Spin your mouse there.
Uh-oh, I think we're asleep.
All right.
There we go.
Why don't we go to my laptop, and you can use the slides here while that wakes back up.
All right. Hi, my name is Jeremy Marsh. This is my colleague, Matt Goodwin. We're from Cactus Software. Cactus Software is a developer of provider credentialing software in the healthcare industry. We have about 1,600 different customers, hospitals, and managed care around the world. Our flagship product is a system known as Visual Cactus. It's a credentialing package, and it's been around for a number of years. It's a traditional client-server, two-tier application. It's got years of enhancement behind it, years of features. It's a big app. And we've been tasked with creating the next generation version of this product. And so we did some technology due diligence, and we decided that Silverlight was a good fit for our UI. And then we started looking around for a good data and services layer. And we saw this thing called RIA Services, and we thought, well, this looks really good, but is this real or is this demoware? Can we actually use this in the real world? And for the talk, that kind of got me to thinking about what kind of criteria do you want to use when you're trying to make that kind of decision. And so I thought I'd share with you some of the things that we thought about when we were deciding whether we were going to go with RIA Services or whether we were going to go with something else. When I'm looking at building a software solution, some of the things that I think about are, is this technology that I'm going to adopt, is it going to be flexible enough to do everything that I need to do with it? Is it going to get in my way? And then also, in addition to, is it flexible enough? What am I going to get out of it? Is it giving me enough benefit that I really want to bring it into the table? Because it's another thing that I have to learn. And some of the things I really liked about RIA Services was that it fit that bill really, really well. And let me go over some of the things that we examined. Okay, so first of all, can I mix RIA Services with plain old web services or REST calls or whatever else, or am I locked into one methodology? And yes, absolutely you can. You can use the invokes in RIA Services, or if you need to fire off something, maybe it's not even your own website that you want to call, you want to go off and talk to some other web service because you're doing a mashup. Absolutely doesn't get in your way. Go party. It'll be waiting for you when you come back. So checking the box there, that worked out great for us. Can I use different databases with RIA Services? That's more of a data layer issue. We're using Entity Framework. We're using 4.1 with DB Context. We support both SQL Server backends and Oracle backends. We accomplished the Oracle support via third-party Entity Framework connector. We're doing our development in parallel, looking at both databases. It's working out very well for us. And then one of the big ones for us, what about MVVM architecture? We really love that architecture. It's really been productive for us, and RIA Services really is fitting in very well. And in fact, we're using Prism to facilitate MVVM. And then finally, I kind of already covered this, what about Entity Framework 4.1? And yes, we are DB Context all the way. It's working out very, very well for us. Now, what do we get out of it in return for our investment? And one of the big ones, automatic generation of the client-side model, basically our DTO objects. There are a lot of technologies out there that will let you do that, but in addition to just getting these base objects, we get row-level change tracking. So as you saw in some of the demos that Brian did, we go through and we make our changes on the client side and we just call submit changes. And RIA Services handles packing that all up in a chunky call, batches them up to the server, and updates the server. We get to propagate our business rules with .shared. You saw that with the custom rule that we had set up for the phone numbers. And also we can use data annotations to put in data validation attributes like required or max string length. And we get to code that once on the server side. We get to replicate that down onto the client side. And so that, helps to keep us from having dual code, supporting 2 code files to do the same thing. We found that to be really useful. A really cool one. This automatic syncing of server-side changes to the client. What that means for us is that, say we've got a server-side only business rule, or maybe we're doing inserts on the client side and we have temporary keys in the rows that we're inserting. We're going to batch those up to the server, and then the server is going to resolve those as permanent keys. One of the things that RIA Services does for us is it traffics those changes back to the client for us. So we do our submit changes, server-side rules fire, we resolve keys, whatever, and we get refreshed on the client side. And we didn't have to do anything to accomplish that degree of tracking, which has been really beneficial for us. It keeps the work on building all of these data access screens really, really quick. And then also it helps with the async programming model. If you've seen many Silverlight demos, one of the things you've seen is that all your web service calls are async. Begin, and then you track an end. It's still an event-driven model with RIA Services, but it wraps up some of the threading issues. For one, you never have to really mess with synchronization contexts. You don't have to worry about marshaling the callback back to the UI thread. So it feels more like a traditional synchronous model, although you do still deal with the events. There's one thing I left off on my slide, and I really regret it, and that was the user authorization stuff that RIA Services offers for doing our login. We are using that to accomplish our logins and to guard access to the web services that we use for manipulating and accessing data, and that's been very, very useful for us. I went through that a little faster than I expected, but I think that is all that I have for you. My colleague Matt now is going to take over. I've talked a little bit about why we did what we did. Matt's going to talk a little bit about what we did. And if you have any questions at the end of the session, we'll be standing around right out here, and we'd love to hear from you guys. Thank you very much.
Yep, need to.
You'll need this. We only have 2 mics.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to take you on a quick tour of what we've done with RIA Services so far. The application we're replacing has over 100 data entry forms and 270 tables that we had to deal with. So we knew up front that we needed a solution that came with built-in change tracking and one that would make it easy for our developers to expose our server-side data on the client. And that's exactly what RIA Services does best. By using RIA Services, our developers can spin up a new data entry form with basic CRUD support in a very short amount of time. And once those services are up and running, they just work. Of all the technologies that we're using in our stack, we've spent the least amount of time getting our RIA Services to work right. They're really solid. But like all real-world applications, we needed ways to plug in our own functionality and business rules at each of the layers. And the good news is that RIA Services provides extensibility at several key places. On the server side, we've created our own domain service-based class, and we're using several of the available virtual methods to take control of the processing of the change sets to do things like enforce security, enforce business rules, create auditing records, and to plug in our own error handling. On the client, we're making use of partial classes and methods that RIA generates from our POCOs to add functionality like some calculated fields and things like that. And then, like Jeremy mentioned, to secure our services, we've built our own. We've taken what RIA Services has, the built-in authentication infrastructure, and we've customized it to work with our own proprietary security infrastructure. And it's not documented really well, but it ended up being pretty straightforward, like Brian showed in the demo.
there's a template for it, and you can add your own properties and things, and that's what we've used to pull off our some of our security. And like Jeremy mentioned, it plays well with a lot of other technologies and patterns. On the server side, we're using it with our own T4 generated POCOs and Entity Framework 4.1. And we're accessing that data through repositories on the server side. And then on the client, we're using MEF, Prism, and the MVVM pattern. Oops, go back. One thing to mention, like any technology, it's not perfect. We have run into one issue that crops up if you are like us and have a lot of domain services with a lot of entities. Visual Studio can become really, really sluggish in everything from compiling to debugging. But the good news is there's somebody out there in the community that's already discovered the source of the problem, and it's a simple fix. It's a single registry entry that disables some Visual Studio plugins, and it makes a world of difference. And I've got a link to it up in my slide. So to summarize real quick, RIA Services provides us with a simple and extensible foundation for building out all the data entry forms that we have to build. And its out of the box features are easy to use and extensible, and they've saved us months of infrastructure work, which has allowed us to concentrate on adding our own unique features and business rules. And with that, if we have enough time, jump over to a quick demo of just some of the basic components of our app. First thing, we've got the beginnings of our authentication. So I'm just going to go in and, I don't know if you caught that part, our software is about doctors, keeping track of information about them. So I'm going to load up doctor here.
Chopped off a little bit. We had some. Can you unmaximize and maybe slide it a little bit?
It looks like
That's fine, good.
So what we have here is one of our data entry forms. This one in particular has a bunch of tables behind it. And just go in here, I'll make a change to this guy. Save that change. And as you saw, it's all those changes were happening with data binding. Might have not noticed. We get real-time binding type change event notifications. It's all MVVM, but again, we're using RIA Services for everything we have built so far. Go up and open another one of our data files. And some of the other things we have, I should have pointed out on the last form, we've got things like field level security, user-defined labels, which you can see over here. And we have these dynamic notes, if you can see these little note indicators here. When I go to the different records, they come and go. All that data was loaded by RIA Services. And then we bind it up on the client using MVVM. And I can go in, make another change, and then I'll just show you that we're some of the stuff that I talked about on the server side. All those changes and all those things I just did were being tracked with logging on the server side that's tied in with our security infrastructure. You can see it's probably kind of hard to tell down here at the bottom. Shows one of those calculated fields was updated when I submitted that transaction.
And that's all being done through your domain service-based class, right?
All being
It's
done.
the interception that you did with the extensibility model.
Yep, all done with extensibility. So that's about it for the demo. Not much to see, but it is a very powerful tool. We're really happy with it.
Great. Well, thank you guys for coming up and at least proving that it's not just demoware. All righty. So let's just wrap this up quick. Summary, you can see a lot of functionality there. You saw it, with the demos I put together on the fly, as well as the one that was there, and what these guys showed, that it is a very functional, powerful, productive kind of tool. But what you end up with, it does still remain a good, clean architecture. And so I've got a 10-part article series I wrote on this technology you can go look at there. There's a link for. As I mentioned, if you go out to justbriannoyes.net, I've got a blog post out there, and what I'll do is I'll update that. I did not have the link that Matt was showing for that workaround to the performance problem. I'll get that added to that same blog post, so you have that to go back to. With that, please do fill out your evals. Thanks a lot for attending, and enjoy the rest of the conference. And we'll be outside for questions if you have any detailed questions you want to ask.